Produced by Betoit, the Masters of Wrestling gives a special thanks to Jesse Hernandez and the EWF, Empire Wrestling Federation, and to each of you, our loyal viewers. And now, on with the show.
In the hallway just outside the arena floor of the world's most famous arena, Madison Square Garden, Vance Armstrong jogs in place, warming up for his match about to be announced, when the EWF World Champion himself, Thor Hansen, walks up to him with hand extended.
Thor Hansen, good to finally meet you, man.
So you're in the next big thing, huh? Guy who's gonna take my spot as champ?
Gee, I don't know about that.
I'm just ribbing, dude.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of Style in the Podcast. I am one of your co-stars, the Master Emir, along with my co-star, ladies and gentlemen. He is a former WWE Tag Team Champion. He is an AEW superstar. He is a legend, ladies and gentlemen. He is Mr. Rico Costantino.
Out on the ranch, on the Ponderosa, taking care of the horses, and had to step in with this special guest. Oh my God. What a man.
What a man. What a story, ladies and gentlemen. We have the privilege today of I'm going to introduce our guest before we get into our regular announcements. Ladies and gentlemen, he is a wrestling creative turned screenwriter. He is the author of Kings of the Ring. He is Steve Tatai. Right here at the bottom of your screen.
Hello. Aloha, boys. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, Steve. We are going to get into it with you today. But before we begin that, Rico, what would look good to you and I?
If you laid a smack down on that subscribe button, share it with your friends, and while you're at it, hit the like.
That's right. Hit the like, share with your friends and family. We also want to remind you before we begin that the Style in the Podcast t-shirts are available now. They are $45, including shipping and handling within these here United States. If you're interested in a shirt, use the email address in the description of the video. Get in contact with us. We'll provide you with payment details, and you'll provide us with your address and your size, etc., etc. Now we will get on with our show. This has been a long time coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Rico and I met Steve at WrestleCon this year in Las Vegas, Nevada. He was one of the most hospitable individuals that I met there. He was truly a tremendous, such a nice guy, Steve. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you, and we wanted to bring you on to share your story today. For those of you who don't know, Kings of the Ring, I'm going to share a link in the description of this video so you can go over and view exactly what Steve has been producing. It is definitely perfect for the times. But before we dive into that story, Steve, because it does involve 80s pro wrestling, and I want to talk about this because the 80s has been coming back so much in pop culture. We see it everywhere. My gosh, Stranger Things. Stranger Things is set in the 80s. It's one of the most successful TV shows in the last 20 years. There's something about the 80s. But when you talk pro wrestling, there's something extra special there in the 1980s. So we want to start there first. We're each going to go through. I'm going to ask you two gentlemen, what was it about professional wrestling in the 80s that was significantly different, that drew in all those masses? And because he is our guest, Rico, I'm going to throw it to Steve first. In your opinion, Steve, what was it? What was the je ne sais quoi that brought everybody in?
Well, the 80s wrestling, I'll consider myself an expert in the sense that that's the era that I became a wrestling fan as a kid. And my demographic holds a special place in history, as we were, the kids that grew up in the 80s, we were the last generation that grew up with wrestling as kayfabe. So we were that last generation where everything that we watched, it was presented as, and we believed everything to be real, a total shoot. So that all the combat that was happening was for keeps. Guys were actually trying to win matches to win the winning share of the
champions. They're not born in the gym. It starts from the inside and it works its way out. Do you feel it more difficult to obtain muscle? Are you tired or perhaps depressed? Then there's a solution. Our brand new partner and sponsor, Care Aesthetics of La Quinta, are here to help you get restored to optimal health. Just use the contact information in this video and schedule your free consultation. Be sure to mention the name of the podcast, whether that be Power and Glory, Styling, Masterclass, or Hey Roma, when doing so. We wish you all the best in your road to optimized health. And now, back to the show.
Actually trying to win matches to win the winning share of the purse. And the entire world was built around that. When there was ever any hints of fakery that anyone would imply, we'd usually shut that down pretty quick. We didn't want to hear it. So it's something you sort of you don't focus on as a wrestling fan. I know older fans in the 80s were like that, but as kids, it was irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And I would be lying if I said I didn't get in more than a few fights at school with other kids arguing over, if Hulk Hogan could beat Ric Flair, in an actual match, as if we're debating a UFC fight.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was one of the huge things about it, was that decade for the fans. It was a completely different experience.
Yeah. And for you, Rico, because you were a little bit older at that time in the 80s. So you were a younger man. So, but what was it for you during that time? I mean, obviously, do you concur with everything Steve said? Was it still resonating with you as a younger man?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember back even in the 70s that they would have the wrestling outcomes on the news because they believed it was a shoot. And they would, like, Jimmy Fly Snuka came off the cage and did that flying, body slam, and the news reported it in the sports. Wow. So back then, kayfabe was kayfabe, and nobody thought it was fake because nowadays there's a little more high flying. Back then it was more wrestling, grappling. It was two guys. I mean, you thought they hated each other, and when they could talk and did the interviews back and forth, you believed that. Yeah. They drew you in with their talent of promos back then. I don't know if they were called promos back then, but that drew me in as a kid because in Vegas, when I grew up, there was AWA, Vern Gagne's league, and they used to come to Vegas at an old hotel called the Showboat
Pavilion. I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'd go there. I mean, Andre the Giant, Road Warriors, Pat Patterson, Rocky Johnson, Sheik, with the boot. He had the loaded boot that he would kick people with.
Yeah.
And it was believable, before kayfabe was broken, and I was a huge fan as a kid. Never thought I'd be a professional wrestler, but I loved the entertainment. I loved, the actual wrestling, the science of it.
Yeah. And I think that's the difference maker there. And I concur with both of you there. There was a believability. There was the shoot style wrestling that still existed. It wasn't just high spot after high spot without meaning. There was a story being told, and there was a battle. It felt like it was a true battle between two combatants in there. And like you said, Steve, I reflect that. I vividly recall, conversations later in the 90s. We're talking with buddies and like, no, that guy, yeah, he's going to beat him for sure. And you really got pulled you were immersed, is a good word to use? Immersed. Immersed in the whole world and the characters. But for me, another thing, like speaking of characters, for me, it was the characters as well. The characters were so well defined, and it was simple black hat, white hat. It was good guy, bad guy. And I don't
no tweeners. There was no tweeners.
No.
It was face, heel.
Face, heel, exactly. And speaking of that, so Steve, I want to kick it back down to you. Tell us, who were some of your favorites growing up watching? Who really captivated your attention?
Well, I think that's one of the big distinctions of the 80s was, if you're going to break down who the most charismatic wrestlers of all time were, the majority of them are going to come from the 1980s. And I think that statement holds up over every decade. And that was one of the main reasons, one of the big reasons why the 80s stuck out so much. I mean, right away you got Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Dusty Rhodes, Roddy Piper, Randy Savage. And it was their charisma that just, it wrapped in so many people. And it engulfed people. And then when it was done through the context of reality, you get these experts doing their promos because it's that immersion you're talking about, that they knew their characters so well And that's one of the big distinctions between back then and modern times. And I think it's inevitable when you're promoting yourself as a career, like in modern times, and where you kind of go back and forth between, reality and fantasy. With shoot and not, because of social media and shoot interviews, and no one's really trying to fool anyone.
Hmm.
But I think, I mean, that they're very good performers and actors in modern times. But there's something about the old days where you're so immersed in your character 24/7 that even when you ran into some fan at a convenience store, you switched on, to that heel persona or whatever. And when
Mhm.
you live this, it becomes that much easier to act out. And if you look at some old like group encounters, like on old NWA or whatever, there's this one clip I love to see. It was the Horsemen were confronting Dusty Rhodes. I think it was after he attacked Tully with a baseball bat or something.
Okay.
But Dusty was at ringside being interviewed, and then the Horsemen come out, and then the other babyface, Nikita Koloff and Magnum, they come out there. So you got about 10, 12 people, but you could look at any single one of those wrestlers and you could see in their face and their body language exactly what was going on in their heads.
Mhm.
You could tell by looking at them who they were feuding with at the time, who they had history with, because they knew their character and their own history so well. It didn't require a script or rehearsal. They were just in it. So you could literally just drop these wrestlers in any scenario and they're going to act upon that. So everyone played their part. Dusty, Flair, everyone with their speaking part. So they said what had to be done, and Flair and Dusty escalated that into a full blown brawl. But my favorite part was looking at all the background guys, from JJ Dillon to Magnum TA. Everybody understood their role, what had led up to this moment so well. And when you immerse yourself in that world of kayfabe, the performance reflects on that. It just becomes that much easier. And
Yeah.
that was one of the great things about that era.
Rico?
And what Amir and I have been saying almost on every podcast, they believed in that character. They lived that character like a method actor. Like Ric Flair was his real name, but he was Ric Flair. And he's even said it. He lived his life like he talked on TV. Styling, profiling, jets. That's the way he lived his life. Dusty Rhodes lived his life that way. They internalized it and they became that being. And back then, the heels did not mix with the faces out in public. They
Correct.
were never seen together.
Yeah.
That kept the kayfabe going. And if they did see each other, there'd be one of them, you know,
Yeah.
brawls out of nowhere.
A slobber.
Because they had to keep the illusion or their characters up.
Yeah.
They would do that and they would be talking. And that is the definition of calling it in a ring.
Yeah.
The finish is the finish. And those guys definitely listened to the crowd in the 80s. They knew what they wanted. And there was, when I was watching it way back when I watched it, they rarely shot people into the ropes and then came off for something. They shot them into the turnbuckles a lot, headbutt to the turnbuckles, raking the eyes on the rope. The heels would do. There wasn't just this drop down shoulder tackle, this, that. You can call them now. I mean, back then you didn't know. If somebody got a shoulder tackle back then, you're like, ooh, my God, he didn't see that
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah.
And then the guy who saw it coming dropped down.
Yeah.
And then he got back and hip tossed the other guy, which
Right.
made sense. And the guy sold it. And he backed up in the corner, the heel. Oh, no, no, no. Give me a break. Give me a break. And then the referee would step in. The referee had as much to do with the match as the two wrestlers, sold everything. We overlook the referees a lot, but the referees did their part too. And it was teamwork in there.
Well,
Because
also,
I know they didn't have earpieces like Vince had when I was there.
well, you mentioned, I go back to that word immersion. That was a great word to use there for the time of the 80s. We talk about the psychology of a match too, calling it in the ring, which we say often, Rico, and we say often, Steve. The matches were not laid out beat for beat for beat, so nowadays what you see is performers waiting for something to happen. And then if if something slips up or there's an accident and it doesn't turn out right, they get lost and they're waiting for the next beat to come. So it can be very dangerous, to the business. Rico, I can see you're about to say something.
No, go
Oh, you're
ahead.
not? Okay, you're just catching your breath. Okay. It's a lot to take in, it's a lot to say. But storytelling wise as well, Steve, so I want to throw that down to you, because that's the subject we're going to get into with your book
Yeah.
series. So storytelling, first of all, we before we jump into that, what was one of the greatest storylines that you can recall back then as a fan, before you knew any better, as an adult, as a youth? What was the greatest storyline that captivated you during that time period?
The biggest angle that always sticks out to me, and this is also as an aside, I've always felt Dusty Rhodes was the best booker of all time, creatively and managing this Super Bowl roster they had. But the biggest piece of evidence I give to that case is the angle he pulled off in 1987, where in the height of the Cold War, he turned the number one Russian heel in the wrestling world, Nikita Koloff. He turned him babyface in a way that had nothing to do with government. It had nothing. He didn't like forsake Russia. He didn't like become American. It was nothing like that. In the deep South, who couldn't have been more hateful of communism in Russia. And this really goes back to the time of the 80s, how big the Cold War was.
Mhm.
And then some younger folks that weren't around back then really need to understand how like every day was like this threat of like nuclear war, and like Russia was our enemies, which is why like Nikita Koloff and Nikolai Volkov became such easy and effective heels. And it was the reality that Dusty Rhodes created in the NWA, which led to Nikita being able to turn babyface as a real representation of wrestling. Because what happened is his arch rival Magnum TA, who was also one of the top rising baby faces in wrestling, got into a real car accident and was paralyzed and was almost killed.
Mhm.
And what the
Yep.
storyline they went with was that Nikita Koloff was so touched by this, he actually stepped in to help Dusty Rhodes, and he
Mhm.
took Magnum's spot. He was so like, moved by his American enemy's plight. And to pull this off in a reality-based world of 1987 in the Deep South, and the pop that Nikita got when he saved Dusty from the Horsemen, it really demonstrates how wrestling, the power of wrestling, can be bigger than anything because it basically overrided all of the news of the entire world. And
Mhm.
that is the power of wrestling. That was always the angle that stuck out for me. And I think in many ways, one could call it the best angle of all time because of that degree of difficulty. But
Yeah.
Nikita Koloff turning babyface in '87.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something there about wrestling transcending even outside influences into the real world narrative, as it were. And it's true. Wrestling did back then, probably because of the kayfabe, did influence a lot actually in pop culture. I mean, my gosh, if we flash forward to the 90s, Degeneration X, well, they influenced people for the bad, but I mean, they really did. But that was an influence that wrestling had. It spilled over from the television into the high schools, into workplaces, and things of that nature. Rico, are there any stories that you remember, any plot stories that you remember from the 80s that really garnered your attention as a fan?
Oh my gosh. I mean, well, the Hogan with the twin referees, I
Oh, yeah.
remember that. The Hebners,
Yeah.
that was a good shocker. That was a good angle.
Yeah.
My gosh. I don't know if that was 80's or 90's, but
Yeah, it was the
I
80s.
remember that one.
88.
1988.
Yep, 88.
Yeah, I remember that. I was just sitting there with my mouth open. Two Hebners
Yeah.
and the plastic surgery, Bobby Heenan. Oh my God. You know, and wrestling does not fit in a box. You cannot compartmentalize wrestling. It crosses all lines. Everybody loves wrestling. They love pro wrestling. I don't care where you're at. People that get it and watch it, especially now with the technology and stuff, it's shown around the world. But, you know, wrestling, it takes you out of the present and puts you in. It's like when you watch a movie,
Mhm.
like a Bruce Willis movie. How many times did Bruce Willis actually save the world? Zero.
right.
But in his movies, you believed he saved the world. He saved the Nakatomi Plaza. He saved the airport. He saved whatever.
Yeah.
But it takes you out of reality for a little bit, which wrestling does,
Mm-hmm.
where you can just escape,
Mm-hmm.
and get involved. You know what's good, you know what's bad. You know that you're going to have a brawl between good and evil, and everybody in the world loves a brawl between good and evil. That
Yeah.
goes back even way before wrestling. The devil and Lucifer.
Yeah.
It's been going on since the beginning of time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you said that perfect.
Okay.
You said that perfectly. But one of the things while you were saying that, and Steve, I'm sure you'll agree with me, as a kid, when we were watching this fantastic world, unfold before our eyes, one of the big stories for me that I really enjoyed, which was so well done, it was the Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man, the exploding of the mega powers, how they built up that story over that time, with Miss Elizabeth being involved and everything else, because you really like I said, as a kid watching it with my kid eyes, I truly believed all of that. But it was more than that. It was kind of like, and I'll use Stranger Things as a reference because I'm sure our viewers are very familiar with Stranger Things. I am a big mark for Stranger Things. I think it's fantastic. As a writer, as Steve, like with yourself, I think the writing behind Stranger Things is fantastic. The fact that they've created a world with these characters that are lovable. There's comedy, there's suspense, there's thriller, there's horror, there's everything going, but it's simple. It's black and white, black
Yeah.
hat, white hat. And it's,
There's wrestling right there.
yeah,
That's wrestling right there.
yeah,
Yeah.
Simple. And what's that old acronym? KISS?
Yeah.
KISS?
Yeah. Keep
Keep
it
it
simple,
simple,
stupid.
stupid. That's it. And I think wrestling has just gone off the KISS platform. Keep it simple.
yeah,
Yeah.
If the wheel's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. It was not broken. I don't know. I think that was a grab by Vince McMahon because he was desperate because WCW was breathing down his neck and he had to do something very dramatic. And I think it forever impacted pro wrestling in a way that not negatively because they're making more money than ever, but it stopped like Steve. I don't know if it was the same for you, but wrestling for me growing up, the WWF felt like its own world, its own planet, like the Stranger Things. Like when they really get into it, it's like a whole it's like a soap opera, but it's more than that. You had
Yeah.
all these characters, you had the action figures, the magazine that sustained the stories that went on, which we'll talk about when we come to your books Steve. Magazines, they were so pivotal in the telling of the story back then. So many elements. And I want to encourage anybody before we go into Steve's story, I want to encourage any of our fans, younger fans who are watching this because we've met them. I've met you. I met you at WrestleCon when I asked you, do you know who these gentlemen are? And you did not. So there's this younger generation. You need to go back in time and you need to study. And Steve will help you with that. Steve's book series will help you with that. Study the 1980s. Know where you came from. Know where this art form came from. You will be amazed. The 1980s was in my opinion, I always say it, Rico, I'm sorry to say the ruthless aggression era was not the greatest. Now, had you been in the golden era, it would have been even more fantastic, but the golden era was it. Steve, am I wrong?
No, not at all. And that's part of what made the 80s. It was more so important because it was the transition into the era that we're still in now.
Yeah.
And that's what younger fans might not fully realize how different everything was before the 80s, where we were on that territory system forever. And now one thing that they try to push in the legend of WWE of how it was formed and all that is that wrestling was somehow not popular before they showed up. It was extremely popular, but it was fragmented,
Mhm.
meaning the popularity was divided throughout the country. Like 1983 was one of the biggest years in wrestling ever, and this before Vince McMahon ever took over. But that's what he seized on. So they choose to create a story like everything was small, smoky, dingy arenas, and then they, exploded things. But what they did is they did spread to areas where wrestling wasn't as popular, like in suburbs and whatnot. But they more unified a lot of wrestling fans and grabbed a lot.
Mhm.
By expanding and growing and gobbling up the other territories, because it was basically like a decade-long battle that saw us transition from multiple territories, where each group had their own TV, their own wrestlers, their own little universes. So you had, you know, 10 to 20 universes all across America and Canada. And over the course of that decade, through this incredible corporate war, it narrowed down to just two, which ended up being NWA, WCW, and WWF.
Mhm.
But this created the whole world that we're in now. Because now younger fans, we look back nostalgically, through YouTube and TikTok clips, fans see things. But it's important for them to understand that the 80s was more than just a bunch of cool matches and incredible promos.
Mhm.
It was an entire process, the 80s. It was a war, and it was a story of what created the world that we're in now.
Yeah.
And we are still in that world because we're still doing the same format. We're still in a relative monopoly era with two at the most. Now AEW and WWE, or back in the days, it narrowed down to WWF and NWA.
It was an epic era, and like Steve said, we encourage you to go back there. But now for the good stuff, ladies and
Well,
gentlemen.
I got one more thing.
Oh, one more
When
thing, Rika.
Vince gobbled up the territories, there went the expansion of talent. Because
Mm,
the territories is what developed the talent. The Von Erich League, Gagne's league, Florida's league. When he gobbled them up, it just limited everything. You couldn't pick the best of the best anymore. He
mm,
wiped them out,
yeah.
and what do you think?
Steve?
Yeah,
Steve,
I
Steve.
agree. Developmentally, it really pushed a lot of things back. The 90s sort of got away with it because a lot of the wrestlers and stars of the 90s were from that older era and had trained in the 80s anyway and sort of brought up in that. So, guys like
Right.
Sting, Sabu, Shane Douglas, whoever, that they were able to, and Shawn Michaels, that they all came up in the 80s anyway. So they were just able to do their thing. And then
But
combined
that's
with all the
just,
icons, that's why it became such the most popular time ever. But then we
yeah.
get that or once Monopoly era begins, and you get that post 80s, 90s era, and that's where we start to run into some more long term issues as far as development, which is what you're tapping into.
Exactly. It's residual. They were trained because everybody was trained there, and everybody who was superstars and all the territories already had trained, and they were already training the people beneath them to be like them and stuff like that. So when the 80's came, the 90's came and stuff, that was just residual
Yeah.
coming in. That's why it lasted as long. And then when they cut off the territories, we had no more residuals. We had nothing coming up that could take the place.
Mhm.
And it kind of stonewalled it.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
that's why we had that era,
Mhm.
And unfortunately,
and
I was
go
going to
ahead,
say,
Steve.
unfortunately, it sort of took away a lot of incentive for Vince and them as well. Once the war was quote unquote won, there was a lot of like self congratulations for a bit because it's sort of like the pressure to keep the heat on was sort of gone.
Mhm.
Because within a couple of years of when WCW and ECW folded, that's when the cable TV rights industry switched and they started to pay big money for wrestling.
Yeah.
And that sort of took off the pressure of WWE, and that's why the pay-per-views started to begin their decline. But it was all based on the idea of not having any true competition to push them anymore. And for good or for bad, Vince McMahon is the type that appears to need that competition to really get the best out of him.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he seems more content to coast.
Mm.
I couldn't agree with you more, Steve. Competition is healthy. It
Mhm.
makes you do like the WCW Monday Night Wars. They were 3-hour programs, and people were going back and forth because they had an abundance of talent.
Mhm.
People switching, people, they had WCW had a cruiserweight division that was just as popular.
Yeah.
Competition's healthy. When you get a monopoly, you don't have to try so hard anymore. He sucked up ECW, he sucked up WCW. So why does he have to produce? He
Yeah.
can sit back and go, whatever I put on, because the cable networks are going to pay for it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
He
ironically,
got,
those were also the biggest money years too, the monopoly era of WWE. Made way
yeah,
more money in the
yeah, but
90s.
it's the money, but not the product.
Yeah.
The product should be your important.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
well, that's when you're
uh,
trying. Well, that's when you're trying to sell out arenas, where you're trying to make money off your arena sales, your ticket sales, your gate sales, your merchandise. When
your
you get a
merchandise.
lucrative TV deal, your money's already paid. It's already in the bank. You've already made your deals. You've got your
You get
sponsorships.
you get lazy,
Yeah, you
Steve.
get lazy.
Yeah,
Steve.
for sure. And part of that was the guaranteed contracts that really kicked in the 90s. And again, that was a product of the wrestling war going on in the early 90s with WCW and WWF, where WCW was starting to win. And then WWF started to switch their deal and they started to give guaranteed contracts. WCW was already doing that as their method to lure talent away from WWF. But that dynamic of guaranteed money, it ended up changing things without that direct incentive, or your money is tied directly into the house or the pay-per-view buys.
Mhm.
So as a result, it just wasn't the same. I'll tell you one of the biggest effects that no one talks about that guaranteed contracts ended up destroying was tag teams. Now, in
Mm,
the 80s was like the heyday of tag teams. It was like the greatest tag teams of all time were all happening in the 80s.
yeah.
But what
Yeah.
happened was by the early 90s, when Eric Bischoff was running WCW, he was looking at the fact that, well, I'm paying both of these wrestlers, Rick Steiner and Scott Steiner, or Butch Reed and Ron Simmons, whatever. I'm paying them the same amount of money, whether they're in one match or a tag match. It's not making sense to me to be forking out all this money for one mid-card tag match. And that's when he began that doctrine of starting to split up tag teams and to sort of de-emphasize tag team wrestling.
Mhm.
And little did we know at the time, but that ended up sort of lasting, throughout the industry for decades. Because I mean, tag team wrestling wasn't dead necessarily, and we still had tons of great tag teams. But that 80s, it looks like there was a real aberration. I mean, when you see so many tag teams around in that era, and we never really reached that heyday since,
Yeah.
since maybe like the Young Bucks in the 2010 sort of, made it popular again.
Yeah.
But direct effect from these contracts in the war.
Interesting fact that you brought up there, Steve, because I've often wondered about that. Yeah, the 80s tag team wrestling cannot be matched. The crispness of the teams, the presentation of them, the storylines behind each team, the marketability, nothing's ever come close. And I've often wondered that. Now we're going to segue into you because obviously our viewers have known, they can tell that you are a wrestling historian, through and through. I mean, you can see it, Steve. I mean, you can pat yourself on the back. You know this industry very, very well. But you're doing a great service now with your book series with Kings of the Ring. So I want to go into what started this for you? What started this journey to want to tell stories well, first of all, tell the audience what Kings of the Ring is first.
Okay, so Kings of the Ring is wrestling's first audio drama podcast. So you think about Haku biting off some guy's nose at a bar, wrestlers getting fired for losing bar fights. Jesse Ventura trying to start a union and Hulk Hogan rats him out. The 2020 report exposing wrestling and a wrestler slaps a journalist, gets in all kinds of trouble. Ric Flair gets in a plane crash, breaks his back. Um, so many behind the scenes incidents that happen in wrestling. You take all those and you assemble them in the form of one giant, like fictional soap opera, like a cable TV drama, and that's Kings of the Ring.
Yeah.
And that's what created this. Because I always felt wrestling, the behind the scenes world sort of naturally lent itself to like a cable TV drama. There's
Mhm.
so many things that happened that we didn't find out till years later through shoot interviews and whatnot about this whole, secret world going on. While we're watching Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage on TV, we don't know about marriages falling apart, back in the locker room, or the politics involved of what led to that and what happened after with Hulk Hogan and everything else. So I wanted to feature a series that we could actually see both sides of the ring and sort of the irony of a wrestling world that is, for kids essentially, where there's all this stuff in the ring happening to entertain children, and behind the scenes is the most rated R sex, drugs, and muscles world that you can imagine in the heyday of the
Yeah.
1980s, plus this enormous corporate war going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. So when did you initially say, I'm gonna jump in, both feet, and I'm gonna jump in, I'm gonna start developing this idea that I have? When did that moment hit you?
Well, yeah, I had this idea for a while. There was a story in like the 2010s, 2015, I think, where okay, so Jeff Jarrett had just left TNA, and this is during the time where TNA was searching for different TV partners because they got booted off of Spike
Okay.
because someone sent an email to the wrong person, and Vince Russo was like secretly working for the company as a booker when Spike TV didn't want it. Again, these are all crazy. You would think this was a TV series on its own.
Yeah.
So that's going on. So Jarrett is gone, and then TNA is sort of burying Jeff Jarrett, or at least taking shots on him on TV and in the press. And then a year goes by, and they're having trouble getting a new TV deal with a high-ranking enough cable carrier. And then there's a rumor that comes out that Spike would be willing to bring TNA back,
Okay.
uh, or to Spike. However, they'd only do it if they put Jeff Jarrett back in charge. And now this was just a rumor at the time, but my first thought was, is like, only in wrestling does this sort of thing happen. I mean, what is that boardroom like when they bring Dixie Carter in? Like, listen, this is the deal, but you're gonna have to bring in the guy you've been trashing for the last year. So
Right.
it's like total cable TV stuff. So that's when I had that idea for it. Now, as it turns out, it was just rumor, and none of those things apparently happened. But it was that idea that sort of got my brain going and reflecting on everything else, from the Montreal screw job to rumors of like there was a rumor that when Hulk Hogan was about to beat Iron Sheik for the world title, which ushered in the whole wrestling year in Hulkamania, the rumor was that Vern Gagne had actually offered the Iron Sheik $100,000 to break Hogan's leg in that match and
Yeah.
to shoot on him. And
Yeah.
it's like, so
Wow.
the idea of that is just incredible. So it's those sorts of things that really got me going. It's like, this would make an incredible, television series.
Now, Steve, but prior to that, did you have any aspirations yourself to step into a ring and become a performer in the world of wrestling?
I actually did train to become a wrestler, but it was only to make myself more useful. But my primary goal in wrestling was always on the creative side, as being a booker. Even before I actually knew that wrestling was for sure a work. Even as a kid, I just sort of, if this, isn't all in the up and up, I think I would like to, do that. And who's going to wrestle who, and
Yeah.
who wins and how, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's something when I became older, around 20, I was actually able to act on that.
Yeah.
And I had moved to Philadelphia, where I hooked up with Alpha the Wild Samoan, who's also Polynesian. I'm Polynesian out of New Zealand, I'm Maori. And then, all Polynesians sort of have that bond. So Alpha took me in pretty quickly, and he trained me to wrestle. And he let me start working behind the scenes. And then I acted as a manager on the show. And within a year, I was actually booking for him. And we were running live TV and all sorts of stuff. So it
Yeah.
was my real heyday of active wrestling.
Yeah.
But I did train to wrestle because he didn't want me anywhere near the ring unless I was trained, and he
Mhm.
did try to get me to wrestle more full time. But it just wasn't my passion really to get in the ring. I was just sort of doing it because I had to. But I preferred more behind the scenes, or at least on the microphone.
So the creative juices were already flowing, and I know what that's like. I know what that's like. Once they start turning, you can't turn them off.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's interesting. Rico, did you ever have any aspirations of being a booker in the business?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I started at 38 and a half.
Hmm.
Okay. That's when I got into wrestling with Jesse.
Yeah.
And I was just trying to learn wrestling as fast as I could and took knowledge from everybody. I was just trying to learn the business. So the creative part didn't come till after I retired,
Yeah.
and then I started thinking of things that I did in my past, what I saw, what I witnessed, from Fit Finley, Pat Patterson, Dean Malenko, the Rooster, Taylor.
Terry Taylor.
Terry Taylor, and stuff like that. And what I learned from Benoit, Jericho, all those people. And then my creative juices started flowing, but I never got back into wrestling because I held two law enforcement jobs
Yeah.
that took most of my time.
Yeah. Speaking of jobs, so Steve, I'm gonna kick it back to you. So when you were working with AFA, when you were working in the wrestling business, was that your sole occupation, or did you, for the benefit of our viewers, what else did you do, or did you do anything else to support yourself and your family during that
Oh,
time?
yeah, I was working other jobs, and that's part of what led to my burnout. We're doing so much, running the company and running TV and this and that, plus still having to, work a side job, just to pay the bills.
Yeah.
There's like the late '90s, early 2000s. It's just what you had to do. Everyone did it.
Yeah.
That there are a few that were able to wrestle full time,
Yeah.
especially as we moved on in the monopoly era as well. Once that took over, the fewer jobs going around. They're paying big.
Yeah. So tell us about the creation then of Kings of the Ring. So when did you finish the first installment? When did you start writing it and when did you finish it?
Yeah, so it probably took about a year to put together, piecing it together. But my official launch was in would be fall of 2018. It launched the same time as the All In show,
Okay.
which was the predecessor of AEW. So I coincided the premiere with that. And so how it came out was originally going to be just a regular old novel, but I discovered the world of audio drama podcasts. So I had a thought of maybe doing an audio book.
Hmm.
Then I was trying to figure out a way to sort of get things out a little quicker, or released to the fans. And then I discovered that they do these podcasts that are fictional,
Hmm.
which is basically just like any other TV series, except audio only and broken up into episodes that are, of course, on demand. Um, and so this older people might remember old radio theater, which is a
Yep.
whole thing before TV. But that's basically what audio drama podcasts are,
Hmm.
just broken up. And I thought, you know what? I already have a video production background, plus with my writing. I do a bit of voiceover work anyway. Let's see if we can make this happen.
Yeah.
And I produced a few episodes. And I'm like, this sounds good to me. Let's go for it. And that's when we did our big premiere at All In 2018.
Well, I've put some,
Excellent.
I'm going to put some samples into this video. For those of you who've been watching, you've probably already seen it because they've already been put into this video. So you see a little bit about what we're talking about now. Now it makes sense to you. But you've had some great voice actors. Great wrestlers from the industry have come on and worked with you to voice some of these characters. Name some of them. I mean, I know you mentioned Lanny Poffo, the late brother of the late Macho Man Randy Savage, but who else has worked with you?
Yeah, so I had the idea to bring in some other guest voice actors from the business, just sort of a gimmick. So Laney Poffo was one of the ones, so was an actual '80s legend. So I was able to get him to play a character. So it was a relatively small part, but we were able to get him playing a guy named Vance Armstrong, who was sort of this next big thing wrestler in the '80s, the would be takeover of the New York group, that sort of thing. And then also had Bill Apter, from
Oh
Pro
yeah.
Wrestling Illustrated, '80s icon. We all love Bill Apter.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
he's kind of goofy anyway. So he loves to do voices. So I know he'd be perfect to come into there.
Yeah.
And then we got RJ City from AEW, who was playing in our storyline homage to Andy Kaufman.
Okay.
He's playing a character named Jimmy Buck, and it's sort of a long storyline with our equivalent of the Andy Kaufman Jerry Lawler deal on Late Night with David Letterman, with the big slap heard around the world.
Mhm.
Sort of build a whole
Yep.
story around that. And that's sort of how the show works. So it's like, so I listed those events in wrestling. So the disclaimer we like to say for the show is, it's like, uh, everything, although the characters are fictional, all the events that happen in this series are based off of something real that
Mhm.
actually happened in the unbelievable world of pro wrestling. And that's sort of the premise, because it's so crazy. Why do we need to invent anything?
Yeah.
But as far as the characters, I sort of have like fictional versions. They're either based on sort of archetypes or at least roles. I purposely try not to match personalities too much, just sort of like for privacy's sake.
Yeah.
Because there's some tragic things that have happened with wrestlers over the years,
Mhm.
and I wouldn't feel right, just sort of using their tragedy just to make an interesting storyline for my series. But I will take some of those incidents and just sort of swap them around to different characters.
Mhm.
But I try to add like a twist to things. Like, so it starts right at the top, with the Vince McMahon role.
Mhm.
But in my world, instead of like, a burly alpha male, bully Vince McMahon type, I have someone who's a little more tortured.
Mhm.
His name's Julian Kane, and he's like, if you picture like an 80s yuppie, sort of a skinny model type, someone you'd think that worked on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Goes to Harvard, and he's sort of messed up mentally because he goes to Harvard Business School and he wants to be accepted as like this rich elite New Yorker.
Yeah.
Yet all of his classmates there, they don't take him seriously because they just know he's like some, circus wrestling guy is where he got all his money from. And then when he goes to his father's promotion, uh, all the big, tough, burly Texas wrestlers, they just see this pretty boy yuppie. And
Yeah.
so no one accepts him anywhere. And because his mother's kind of a nightmare as well, it sort of builds angst and anger and fury. And he's a little bit sociopathic. So he's going to take this to destroy the world. So I sort of got this from. There was an old article in 1985 Sports Illustrated when Vince McMahon's first big mainstream breakthrough.
Yeah.
And he had a quote in there that said, if my father knew what I was going to do with WWF, he never would have agreed to sell me the company.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any actual heat between them, and not since. But the idea that they were like opposed to each other, that intrigued me. And I thought, well, what if we went all the way and he actually like despised his father and hated him? And what if him, expanding nationally was more than just a business move, but a way to like destroy everything his father built,
Yeah.
by ruining all this stuff. And so
Yeah.
that's sort of the impetus of the whole series. But
Yeah.
that's how it works. So these different characters with a different twist, but all with the building blocks of what really happened in the wrestling world in the 80s.
Absolutely fantastic.
Right.
You speak about
That
special.
is.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You speak about special guests. Have you got any new involvement, any new attachments, any new voiceover cast joining the cast?
Yes, I will reveal the scoop here on your show.
Okay.
We have two new guests that are going to be on for the seventh and final season of Kings of the Ring. The first one is going to be our first female wrestler that's going to be on the show, and it's going to be played by Hollywood Haley J.
Okay.
Which people know from she was on Netflix on The Wrestlers about the El Snow OVW show. She's also in Booker T's Reality of Wrestling, and she's on Women's of Wrestling. I think she's got the look, the attitude, the charisma. I think she's one of the best free agents around, and I think she's going to be a huge, huge star. So I'm very lucky to have her on the show. She's going to be playing a character called Terry Blaze, someone that was teased in the last season because up to this point we haven't had any female wrestlers. I try to keep the show pretty authentic, and unfortunately, the '80s wasn't very big for ladies wrestling, and the few bits that there weren't necessarily flattering. It was either things that just people didn't like, like Glow, or something very specific like the Cyndi Lauper stuff. Otherwise, we get into that whole fabulous moolah, that whole dark world, and it's
Right.
my feeling was if I'm going to put out a ladies wrestling story based on reality, I don't want it to be something so dark or a downer.
Right.
So I finally came up with an idea this year, which will be debuting in this series, and it's sort of based on the real lives of Medusa Maselli and Sherry Martel, which were two of the few lady wrestlers who came up through the 80s. And so it's sort of playing on the reality of the situation. So we've got a young girl, Terry Blaze, who's trying to break into the wrestling business at a time where the wrestling business wants nothing to do with women's wrestling.
Yeah.
And that's her struggle, that's her journey, and we'll see what happens in season 7 for her.
Okay. And then
All right.
who's your other guest?
And our final guest is going to be a big one. We've actually secured the services of Mr. Doc Gallows, one half of the Good Brothers,
Oh, wow.
co-founding member of the Bullet Club.
Yeah.
He's doing a whole new thing now to show us the light. But he's one of the most, I consider one of the more important wrestlers of the modern era because of how the Bullet Club changed the business. And he in particular, him and Carl Anderson, how they took the Bullet Club from a great group of heels, but they sort of defined their personality of the Bullet Club. And I believe that's what transcended it from this, New Japan heel gaijin group into something that took over the world and eventually ended up spawning AEW and changing wrestling all over.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy to have Luke Gallows on here. He's very excited about the show. He's going to be playing a character called Brutal Bob Walker. He's actually taking over a smaller character Now Bob Walker, like I say, there's different versions. He's based on like Ole Anderson, at least in that role. So he's sort of this grumpy older wrestler that doesn't like anyone or anything. So I said it's not based completely off a real personality. I guess in Ole, in this guy's case, I'm sort of breaking that rule. But he takes over for Bob
No, you're
Walker.
just right on the edge. You're on the edge. You're skirting that fine line.
Well, Bob Walker, he
But
has a lot to do this season, and Gallows is
wow,
going to voice him.
you got an impressive mind. I'm telling you. I
Oh, thank
am
you.
just excited for you. I really am. I mean, it's woo.
You know,
You are creative.
you know what I'm excited
Thank
for,
you.
Rico. Okay, so for a long time, I've written a lot of scripts. In fact, I wrote a teaser script the other day. I've got to share that with both of the two of you gentlemen. Um, what I'm seeing here is I'm seeing another TV show set in the 1980s. That's what I'm seeing from all of this. Now, Steve, has that entered your mind?
Absolutely. That would be the main goal for this. Because, like I said from the beginning, I think it's make a perfect TV series. It just lends itself so naturally. So yeah, have sort of moved into screenwriting over the years as well, and this is one of the main projects that I've been pushing around town, so to speak.
Mhm.
I won't reveal too much where we're at. I don't want to jinx anything.
No.
But
No, no,
things
no.
are in the works, and we're hoping for some good stuff to come out of this.
Well,
Well,
as
if you ever need an old guy,
Perfect.
if you ever need a youngish guy, right here. But no, but I would love to be involved in the creative side, to be perfectly honest. I mean, that would be, like I said, I think, with a show like that involving wrestling set in the 80s, I mean, you're talking another Stranger Things kind of deal, not with the sci-fi and all that, but you're talking the same feel because you're setting it in the 80s. You've got that whole
That's
world that you're immersing yourself in. Oh, Rico,
I just got an idea.
what is that?
Wasn't Adrian Street part of the 70s and 80s?
yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
I'm throwing my bid in the hat.
Perfect. But Adrian Street is a perfect representation for the 80s. That is one of the big differences from modern times to the 80s, was what a big part like homophobia played in wrestling. I
Mhm.
mean, it was
Yeah.
guaranteed heel heat. Everything was based around it. I still find it funny. Well, not funny, but it's so striking. Like when I see modern wrestling, like an AEW, you've got like Anthony Bowens of the Acclaimed, who's like openly gay, and they did an angle where like some heel female kissed him, and then he's like, you're barking up the wrong tree. I'm gay, and like the arena explodes,
Mhm.
and like it strikes me because if they ever tried to do anything like that, like 1985, it would have quite an opposite effect.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So
Quite quite the contrary. But I must ask, you have gone down the rabbit hole of the 1980s. Are there any plans that you will move into the 90s and come out with another series that takes place in the 90s?
yeah, this would be something that would sort of slow cook. That this will be the final season here. So the ending will be a bit open-ended. We won't know exactly how this is going to work. I do base things off of reality in a bigger picture sense,
Mhm.
but there are definitely twists that I throw in or little what ifs could throw things off.
Mhm.
So the premiere of the new season is going to be the 4th of July coming up. So the 4th of July, the final battle for America will take place in this wrestling world as territories are struggling and things are starting to narrow down, but we don't know about ownership. And will the massive Empire Wrestling Federation, are they going to win this or are they going to get knocked out? We'll have to wait and see for this season.
Mhm.
And if Kings of the Ring does come back, then it would come back into the 90s. And we would definitely
Wow.
fast forward that. But there's a
Rico,
whole other world up
Wow.
there as well that we
Rico,
could
Oh
tap
my gosh. Oh my
Rico.
gosh.
I want a ticket to see this one in the theaters.
So do I.
This is
So do I.
this is what wrestling is needed, fans. This is what it needs.
Yep.
We need to go behind the scenes of the 80s. Rico, cut you off. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, no, exactly. We need to go behind the scenes because everybody knows what's projected. They don't know. And believe me, they are, and they will be interested
Mhm.
on what Steve's doing. I mean, That's gold right there.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much source material. It's like you look at like Marvel Comics or DC Comics that make movies from that. Wrestling has more source material than anything.
Hmm.
It's like, I barely ship the ice, in the 80s. I try to use as much as I can, but there's so much. The 90s had even more, and even after that. So much happens behind the scenes. It's such an interesting industry, and the double life that the wrestlers, especially in the 80s, had to live, where you're living this alter ego around the clock,
Yeah.
and the toll that
Yep.
takes on a person and their family. And it's just it's a fascinating era.
Yeah. Last question I've got for you, Steve. Source material wise. So, how did you source through these stories? Did you use witnesses? Did you use accounts in books? What was your procedure to getting these stories down?
Everything. So every story I'd ever heard. Also, my perspective as someone actually grew up during this time helps as well.
Hmm.
I try to keep things all well-rounded, and I try to keep the authenticity of the 80s in wrestling as well. But I've worked with a lot of older wrestlers when I was with AFA in the Northeast. Guys like Tito Santana, Superfly Snuka, Nikolai Volkov, Nikita Koloff. I've been around so many of these older wrestlers, get to pick their brains over the years. And then you just hear different stories being told, through shoot interviews and other behind the scenes stuff. And everyone's revealed so much with their autobiographies. So it's like
Yep.
there's so much that reveals everything. So I'll just, if I find out a new story about like how Bob Backlund, arm wrestles some guy in some bar or something, like some anecdote. And so the challenge for me as the head writer of the show is to find, organic ways to slip that, into an episode to fill that out, but also do it in ways to be entertaining, but that still, make it part of the bigger story. So all the characters are moving forward. And that's
Yeah.
the fun of it as well.
Now,
Excellent.
can fans actually purchase the books themselves, the physical hard print books? Are they available for fans to purchase if they don't want to listen to the audiobook, if they want to read it?
Yes, absolutely. We have hearing impaired fans, they watch wrestling too. So the books are there, available on Amazon. You can get everything on our website, which is kingsotr.com. But there are four novels right now, adaptations that have been published so far, each one covering a season. So you can get through the book. Otherwise, it's for free as audio drama podcast on all podcast apps.
Mhm.
You can link from the website, kingsotr.com, or through our social media. Everything is Kings OTR. So on Twitter, everything else.
Mhm.
But yeah, there are absolutely books available for people to read as well. Because some people they just don't like to listen to audiobooks or anything like that. They
Yeah.
like good old fashioned reading.
Yeah, I do like the feel of a book. You touch the book, and I'm going to encourage our fans right now because I know there are a lot of you out there that are big 1980s pro wrestling fans. I encourage you not just to listen, I encourage you to go on that website and purchase that book. So you can sit there when you're on a flight or something, or train ride, or whatever you're doing, flick open those pages and immerse yourself.
Sit on the Ponderosa after the chores. I can open the book and start reading.
Yep, just take yourself on that journey. There's nothing like it. Rico, have you got any closing sort of questions or anything you want to ask Steve?
No, Steve, you've been fantastic. It's been an honor to have you on the show. It
Thank
was an
you.
honor to meet you at WrestleCon. You were more than nice, a gentleman, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, you were just fantastic. Yeah, and I, liked you and told Amir, I said, this guy's wonderful.
Yeah.
And my gosh, here I am, and he was just treated me like I was family already,
Yeah.
and I just honor that. And I just appreciate you coming on the show and telling this fantastic story. You got a lot to tell and a lot of knowledge, and you do your research. And wrestling fans, if you want to know, get the book, get the audio books, and follow because I'm going to. I'm telling you, I grew up in this era, and he's told me things that I didn't know. So my gosh,
Yeah.
I got to get up
Thank
to
you.
speed.
Yep. We got to jump into a whole new world with all of
Yeah,
those.
especially if I'm going to play Adrian Street.
Yeah,
Ah,
exactly.
Yes.
I guess,
So,
I guess when you go into the 90s, Steve. I guess I could play young Hunter Hearst Helmsley. It's
Of
just an
course.
inside.
We all ready for that.
Yeah, yeah. But I tell you what, Steve, you're such a pleasant guy. There's so much more to this story. I want to have you back. We mentioned Glow in there. You mentioned Glow.
Yep.
And of course, we're friends with the Royal Hawaiian, April Hom. So
Ah,
who portrayed, one of the pivotal figures from Glow. So maybe there's something there that we can do an episode with you down the line. But we're definitely, we want to have you back on the show. We want to talk more about specific things. But I think this was a nice overview to introduce you fans to Steve, to his world, Kings of Wrestling, Kings of the Ring, rather. And we will put the links in the description of this video for the audio podcast and for the website where you can go and purchase your books there. All right.
all right.
So,
Thank you so much.
absolutely. Rico, your closing statement.
My motto is what your mind can conceive, your heart can achieve.
Amen. Amen. Right there. Thank you so much, Steve, for being a guest on Styling this week. Thank you to all of our fans for checking in. We will see you next week right here on Styling. Until then, God bless.